I'm joined by Admiral James Stavridis, retired four-star U.S. naval officer, formerly, of course, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, operating executive with the Carlyle Group and in the firm, and chair of Board of Investors of McClarty Associates. He does a lot of stuff, and he comes in once a week to talk with us. Happy New Year, Admiral. Good to have you back.
Great to hear your voice in 2020, Hugh.
Now, my New Year's resolution for the show was to make sure that our focus on national security and great power competition was not submerged beneath breaking news. We always do breaking news. We covered the attack on the embassy by the minute on Tuesday, but I just don't think American national news media does much on grand strategy. Do you agree or disagree with that, Admiral?
No, I think obviously. In fact, my overriding reaction to what's happening in the Gulf and on the Korean Peninsula is that we're not sufficiently strategic. We're playing tactical cards pretty well, but grand strategy has never been a forte of the United States, frankly, going back to the Nixon administration, which you know well. That's the last time we had really coherent national strategy.
Now, what do you put that down to? Part of it may be, in fact, our news media, which always, because of market forces, is obliged, as this show is, to focus on what's happening here and now. People want to know, after 9/11 especially, am I under threat? Are bad things happening to good people, places around the world? But you look at the military academies, you look at our journals, it doesn't look like grand strategy or great power competition gets much attention.
There are some pockets in the overall security firmament, if you will, where this is occurring. And I would say less the academies, which have a very young population preparing to go into service, are war colleges, which are our institutes of graduate studies in the military. National War College in Washington, D.C., Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, Army War College in Carlyle, Pennsylvania, etc. These are individuals in their 40s who had command at sea, command of squadrons. They're coming back. That's where American grand military strategy is being thought through. That's where, for example, in the 1930s, we were thinking about what a war with Japan would look like, and so forth. That is still quite alive and well. But broad national security, as opposed to military security, that is not happening anywhere, and we are poorer for that.
Let's talk a little bit about defining terms, because I'm going to repurpose my YouTube channel to do a national security conversation. Any conversation on this show that involves grand strategy or great power competition will end up at my YouTube channel. People don't want to have to listen to every minute of the show to get to the stuff that they want. Let's define those terms, and I'm doing it today with you, with General David Deptula, with General Melvin Spees. I'm gonna bring in more people who have served at the flag rank, and let me question my assumption with you, and tell me if you think I'm wrong. I think at flag rank, you get to have a view of the world that very few other professions have outside of the C-level suite, maybe in Silicon Valley and banking, are flag rank officials who've actually had to study the world map.
Absolutely correct. And part of it is just the nature of the profession. The U.S. military lives in the world. We're forward deployed at all times. Second is because the stakes are so high. We're dealing with life and death issues constantly. Thirdly, we deal with events at speed. The acceleration and pace of international events, I would argue, moves faster than anything else in the circuit. And then fourth and finally, as we were talking about a moment ago, Hugh, we have a very structured path that begins you as a sort of a student of the world at your military academy. You then deploy, you come back and go to a low-level war college, you deploy some more, you come back, go to high-level war college. By the time you're an admiral or a general and making deployments at 1- and 2-star grade, you are very well prepared for the international scene.
All right, so let's define those two terms, grand strategy and great power competition. What is grand strategy?
Grand strategy is bringing together every element of national power and describing how it impacts the global world. So that's our military power, obviously, but it's also our economic power, our political power in the world, our ability to move events at the United Nations, for example, our diplomatic power, what our diplomats do, our cultural power, how are we harnessing the great American ability to tell the story and move the message in the world. All of those elements come together to create a strategy for the country that then is played into the global world. What's the role of the United States on the world stage? What's our role specifically in various regions, but globally? What are we trying to accomplish? That's grand strategy.
President Nixon used to define the objective as the ongoing incremental increase in liberty and literacy in a growing number of stable regimes within or aligned with the West. I've always thought that was the best definition of our objective. Mm-hmm. Would you add anything to that?
In today's world, I would take out literacy. I think that train is underway, if you will. It's way out of the station. I would put in something along the lines of to increase global cultural awareness of freedom. I think he's on the right path with democracy, which is a political process, but it's also about cultural impact, knowledge of the world, interaction. There's another term there besides literacy.
It was liberty and literacy. Yeah, he always said liberty and literacy. Literacy was a stand-in for really rising economic levels across the globe. Maybe growth.
And I think I would say prosperity. I would say prosperity would be your other, liberty and prosperity, because as a general proposition, regimes that are moving in a prosperous direction are more stable, have more invested in the system, are less likely to upset the grand strategic balance. So I'd say liberty and prosperity.
Now, to that grand strategic balance, what is great power competition? Now, the short term is GPC, and I hear a lot of uniformed people talking about GPC. What is great power competition?
First of all, we ought to be very, very afraid when we hear an acronym like GPC. That's the sort of military speak. I think great power competition is, broadly speaking, back to grand strategy, is who are the other actors in the international system who are themselves creating grand strategies that will collide with ours. So in today's world, most obviously it's China. It's certainly Russia, simply because they have nuclear weapons. They're not very grand in the broadest sense, but because they still have a significant nuclear arsenal, they have to be included. And then at a lesser level, I'd include the European Union, somewhat diminished with the departure of Great Britain, but still a force, could be over time. And lastly, I'd say India fits into it. That's kind of the top two tiers of grand power strategy. Below that, you look at countries like Brazil, Nigeria, whose population is exploding. Indonesia will be a big player. Japan still has a role to play. All of those play. But when the military uses an acronym like GPC, they're talking about U.S., Russia, China.
Now, within the framework of grand strategy and great power competition, here's a headline. Israel, Greece, and Cyprus set to seal $6 billion gas pipeline deal. Turkey bitter and enraged about it. Okay, this is just one story. Israel's found all of this natural gas. They're going to build it and send it to Cyprus, who will send it to Greece, who will send it on to Europe up through Italy. Turkey is threatening action. How does that fit into what we've been talking about? It's one discrete breaking news story. It's a front page story on the Financial Times. But how does it fit into the broader categories that we were talking about?
It is an example of the collision between economic desire for that prosperity we just burned into the definition alongside military action, because Turkey is going to potentially use military assets. And another point of collision, Hugh, is NATO. Turkey is a NATO nation. Thus, their competitions, their collisions, their conflicts get caught up in the U.S. frame of reference. So from a grand strategy perspective, we had to look at that corner of the world, that Eastern Mediterranean, and we ought to have a sub-strategy, a strategic plan for how we're going to balance the competing equities of Israel, tight friend, ally, partner, Turkey, NATO ally, but somewhat drifted away from us. Cyprus, member of the European Union. How do we square that circle? What are U.S. objectives? How do we bring our various role and elements of power to bear? And the place where that ought to be happening, I'll close here, is the National Security Staff at the White House. This is what Robert O'Brien should be working on, a broad, coherent strategy that brings all those elements of power together and take it into the Situation Room, and when necessary, bring it to the president and the cabinet, the actual National Security Council. So NSC staff ought to be working on GPC, if you want to keep it in the acronym world.
And what, last question for this morning, when you've got a Pentagon planning staff and we see that Turkey set a maritime border with Libya late last year and they are proposing to move troops into Libya, what does the Department of Defense do in response to that with this Israel, Greece, Cyprus axis on the other side and Turkey saying we're moving into Libya? What's DOD do?
DOD should, first and foremost, work all of its contacts in Turkey to try and fully understand the extent to which Turkey is going to use military operations to undermine this project, if you will, of Israel. We ought to be working equally with our allies, partners, and friends in Israel to understand this. Thirdly, over on the EU-NATO side, there are many equities down in Libya as well. So DOD, first and foremost, should be gathering information and intelligence at all levels, and we have good pipe at the military-to-military level in all three places. Secondly, we ought to be increasing our level of raw surveillance and intelligence operations over the Eastern Mediterranean. I would argue that includes more ships in the Sixth Fleet, which is our fleet which manages this part of the world. And third and finally, the military ought to be hand in glove with the State Department, with our other intelligence agencies outside the Department of Defense, the CIA most obviously. It ought to be working closely with our economic partners to understand the economics of the situation. So DOD has a huge role to play here, but only one part of it, back where we started. Grand strategy is different than military strategy. That's why we need more emphasis on using all of those tools. So we work with allies, we keep the interagency working together, and even involve the private sector, as we're going to need to in the example you've raised for us this morning. What a good discussion.
Admiral James Stavridis, we will have many throughout 2020, I hope. I appreciate your always being up early and on call to join me for these sorts of conversations. Happy New Year to you.